Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you. The words of Nellie Connolly, the wife of the governor of Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. Until then, there had been good reason to doubt it. Kennedy's brand of liberalism was not popular in the Lone Star State, and even that day, these leaflets were being distributed among the crowd. President Kennedy had made many enemies.
Radical elements made statements. Why don't we go to the root of the problem and eliminate the number one man, JFK?
This guy, Leopoldo, insisted we should do something. So immediately I realized that there was an assassination plot.
He says, can you get me 4 automatic rifles with a telescope sight on? 'Cause I got the money. Money's no object.
It was a question of how and when, not a question of whether, as to the necessity of eliminating Kennedy.
Every week, every president receives threats to his life. I doubt that there was any special threat.
In the car may have been the victim, may have been struck by shots. We don't know. Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound. And just now we've received reports here at Parkland that Governor Connolly was shot in the upper left chest, and the first unconfirmed reports say the president was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head. The policeman says, no, you cannot come in here. You cannot come in here. We'll let nobody else in. It was definitely the president. First of all, we have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital.
The President of the United States is dead. President Kennedy has been assassinated. It's official now. The President is dead. There's only one word to describe the picture here, and that's grief.
80 minutes after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. The public events of that day in Dallas remain painfully familiar to most Americans, but it's now possible, for the first time, to piece together some of what was going on behind the scenes, using official government documents that have only recently become available. Without any investigation, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, reported to Attorney General Robert Kennedy 2 hours after the assassination, "I think we have the man who killed the president." The president's body came back to Washington on Air Force One. And everyone now had only one question: who killed John Kennedy, and why? As America mourned the lost leader, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, was determining how best to end speculation about the assassination. The massive solemnity of the last rites made it all the more difficult for Americans to accept that their president had been killed by a lone nut called Lee Harvey Oswald. So great an event could surely not have so pathetic a cause. Every sort of rumor with implications the new president found horrendous now sprang up. Some accused Johnson himself of being behind the assassination. Others saw the new president as the next target of a conspiracy aimed at destroying the whole system of American government. On November 29th, Chief Justice Earl Warren agreed to chair a presidential commission. The rumors must be quenched and speculation ended, Johnson told Warren. Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach had already written to Johnson's top aide. The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin and that he did not have Confederates. After 10 months' work, the Warren Commission produced its verdict. It exactly echoed the Katzenbach memo. Oswald was the lone assassin, and there was no evidence of a conspiracy. The conclusions were presented as unanimous. The then Congressman Gerald Ford declared, "The monumental record of the Warren Commission will stand like a Gibraltar of factual literature through the ages to come."
I think the Warren Commission has, in fact, collapsed like a house of cards, and I believe that the Warren Commission was set up at the time to feed pablum to the American people for reasons not yet known, and that one of the biggest cover-ups in the history of our country occurred at that time.
Senator Schweiker's views are based on his official investigation into the performance of the FBI and the CIA at the time of the assassination.
The most important thing was that the intelligence agencies did all the wrong things if they really were looking for conspiracy or to find out who killed John Kennedy.
Schweiker's committee was formed as a result of Watergate. Its findings, together with startling new evidence unknown to the Warren Commission, caused Congress to set up its own Assassinations Committee. It has a larger staff and a larger budget than the Warren Commission, plus its own investigators. Its mandate includes a complete reinvestigation of the murder of John F. Kennedy.
The committee will come to order. At this stage, we are playing the cards very close to our vest. We don't want things to come out piecemeal and have speculation begin down one line of inquiry. And so at this time, we aren't revealing or going into any of the evidence.
The Assassinations Committee is now holding sessions behind closed doors after beginning as a public shambles. It's unlikely to issue a report this year, but it is now possible to make public the source of many of the committee's new leads. For years, many of the essential documents relating to the Kennedy assassination were kept classified under tight security in the National Archives. But under the Freedom of Information Act, many official documents that the government and its agencies would prefer to keep secret have been pried out. Within the past few months, in much publicized releases, the FBI has made available some 80,000 pages of its own records about the assassination. Significantly, however, the Bureau has still held back 10% of its material, claiming reasons of national security, or to protect informants, or on grounds of privacy. Many documents released under the Freedom of Information Act are a source of frustration. This CIA memo has half-blank first pages, then a blank page, and so on and on. Such industry by the censor has fueled suspicions that a cover-up is continuing.
Well, there have been some instances of files being, I guess you would say, maliciously withheld or even destroyed. Let me give you one example without running the risk of...
Claimed to have found it 1 hour after the assassination in the Texas School Book Depository, and that it belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald.
Without any doubt, he's the killer. The law says beyond a reasonable doubt and to a moral certainty, which there's no question that he was the killer of President Kennedy.
This photograph, purportedly showing Oswald holding the murder weapon, appeared on the front page of Life magazine in February 1964. It was one of 2 that had been found by police with Oswald's possessions the day after the assassination. The pictures appeared in the Warren Commission report and helped convince the American public of Oswald's guilt. On television, 2 of the Warren Commission counsel and chief apologists made great play with the photograph.
We know that Oswald had possession of that rifle because we have his wife saying that it was, quote, faithful rifle of Lee Oswald.
We obtained the actual photographs that the Warren Commission used from the National Archives and showed them to a top forensic expert. Detective Superintendent Malcolm Thompson worked for 30 years in the Forensic Science Laboratory and Photographic Unit in the British Police Force. His job was to spot fakes and match likenesses. Thompson minutely examined the Warren Commission photographs. Among other things, he compared them with the photographs taken of Oswald by the Dallas police. The Dallas police photo showed Oswald had a rather pointed chin. On the Warren Commission photograph, even allowing for the shadow, the chin appeared unmistakably square.
One can only conclude that Oswald's head has been stuck onto a chin, not being Oswald's chin. Then, to cover up the montage, retouching has been done, and when we consider this area of retouching here, one finds that there's a bulge in the line, and without doubt that shows this area between the head and the pillar has been retouched But when one examines the shadow content, one sees the gun at an angle to the body which does not relate to the angle in the shadow. The gun is reaching far more out to the right, more in a horizontal position here in relation to the body shadow than the gun is actually being held by the person.
Are you suggesting that those shadows have actually been touched in?
They've been touched in. Again, the arm just doesn't look natural. In fact, it looks as if it's been stuck onto the body.
After examining these photographs, what is your professional opinion on them?
I think they're a fake.
Thompson's view was confirmed by the commanding officer of the Canadian Air Force Photographic Department. He found that the heads were exactly the same size, although the bodies were 2 centimeters different. He then made transparencies of the 2 heads, one red and one blue. He then superimposed the 2 supposedly different heads and found that they matched exactly, a photographic impossibility. The Warren Commission's case against Oswald centered on the celebrated theory of the single bullet that allegedly went through both the president and Governor Connally to emerge virtually unscathed. One Warren Commission lawyer said, to say they were hit by separate bullets is synonymous with saying there were 2 assassins. In other words, 2 people were involved. Newly released documents about the Warren Commission deliberations show the members were far from unanimous about the controversial single bullet theory. Former Senator John Sherman Cooper is the first member of the Warren Commission to agree to talk on television about what went on inside the deliberations.
Yes, there were disagreements. I think the most serious, one that comes to me most vividly, of course, was the question of whether or not the first shot went through President Kennedy and then through Governor Connally, who was sitting on the jump seat in front of him. I heard Governor Connally testify very strongly that he was not struck with the same bullet, and I could not convince myself that the same bullet struck both of them, although we had experts who said it could. And
you mean that you yourself weren't convinced about the single bullet theory, which...
No, I wasn't convinced by it. Neither was Senator Russell.
Just before he died in 1971, Senator Russell caused the first cracks in the Warren Commission's Gibraltar of factual literature. Russell said publicly, "I think someone else worked with Lee Harvey Oswald." Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry was in the fatal motorcade just ahead of the president and cannot accept the Warren Commission view that the only shot came from behind.
I think there's a possibility that one could have come from in front of us. We've never been able to prove that. But just in my mind, and by the direction of the blood and brain from the president from one of the shots, it would just seem that it would have to be fired from the front rather than behind. I can't say that I could swear that I believe there was one man and one man alone. I think that there's a possibility there could have been another man.
In his 12 hours of questioning by Dallas police, Oswald continuously denied he had shot the president. The notes of his interrogation have never been produced. The Assistant Attorney General of Dallas, William Alexander, was present at several of the interrogation sessions, and he remains disturbed by the curious demeanor of Lee Harvey Oswald.
I was amazed that a person so young would have the self-control that he had. It was almost as if he had anticipated the situation. It was almost as if he had been rehearsed or programmed to meet the situation that he found himself in. It was almost as if he anticipated every question, every suggestion, every move that any of the people in charge of him made.
Rehearsed by whom?
Who knows?
The question, who was Lee Harvey Oswald, is central to the mystery. It's now possible to re-examine Oswald's life in the light of documentary evidence unknown to the Warren Commission or deliberately withheld. Oswald spent his early years in an orphanage. At the age of 17, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps. A year later, he was sent to one of the most secret U.S. bases in the world, at Atsugi in Japan. From here, the CIA operated spy flights over communist China using U-2 reconnaissance planes. Oswald became a radar operator, granted special security clearance with access to top-secret codes and flight plans. Oswald was known as something of a loner. He began to learn Russian, and he earned the nickname Comrade Oswaldkovich. The Marxist Marine in the CIA base seemed a curious contradiction. He crossed paths with Sergeant Jerry Hemming, who also served in radar control at the Atsugi base, naval intelligence.
The first time I met Oswald, I felt he was working for somebody, and I felt at that time it was naval intelligence.
What made you feel that he was working for an
By the
intelligence
questions he was asking, and by his obvious knowledge of my background. Somebody had briefed him.
In autumn 1959, Oswald suddenly left the Marines and went to Moscow. Unexplained money and an unlisted flight enabled him to arrive at the American Embassy. There he told Consul John McVicker he intended to become a Soviet citizen and turn over American radar secrets. McVicker felt he was following a pattern of behavior in which he had been tutored by a person or persons unknown, seemed to be using words he had learned but did not fully understand. In short, it seemed to me there was a possibility that he had been in contact with others before or during his Marine Corps tour who had guided him and encouraged him in his actions. Oswald went to work in a radio factory in the Russian city of Minsk. But in America, at the same time, Oswald's identity was causing a problem for the FBI. In a secret memorandum, J. Edgar Hoover wrote on June 3, 1960, there is a possibility that an imposter is using Oswald's birth certificate. Later, another memo described that possibility as fact. During his 2.5 years in Russia, Oswald got married to Marina Prusakova, the niece of a Red Army colonel. He is thought to have been a Soviet intelligence officer. In 1962, Oswald was allowed to leave Russia for the United States. The defector was allowed back into the country with no hostile reception. Richard Sprague was the director of the House Assassination Committee at its formation.
His trip to Russia raised a number of questions that we wanted to get into. For example, when any American went to Russia and renounced his American citizenship and subsequently changed his mind and wanted to come back to this country, upon returning to this country, there was a thorough debriefing by the CIA, with one exception, as far as we could ascertain, Oswald.
The key is, why did they let him bring a Russian-born wife out contrary to present Russian policy? He had to get a special dispensation from the highest levels to bring his Russian-born wife out. That in itself says that somebody was giving Oswald highest priority, either because we had trained and sent him there and they went along and pretended they didn't know to fake us out, or in fact they had incalcated him and sent him back here and were trying to fake us out that way. But he got a green light that no other American had gotten at that particular point in time.
The CIA Deputy Director of Plans, Richard Helms, swore to the Warren Commission that the agency never had or contemplated any contact with Oswald. That testimony is now known to be false. A CIA document by an unnamed agent has recently been released under the Freedom of Information Act. The officer writes, "We showed intelligence interest in Oswald and discussed the laying on of interviews." It is now known that the Soviet secret police, the KGB, did consider using Oswald, according to a top Soviet intelligence official who defected to America. Ex-President Johnson said, "I don't think the Warren Commission or me or anyone else is absolutely sure of everything that might have motivated Oswald or others that could have been involved. But he was quite a mysterious fellow, and he did have connections that bore examination." Shortly after his return from Russia, Oswald took a Greyhound bus to New Orleans. He lived there until September 1963, 2 months before the assassination. At that time, New Orleans was one of the main centers of right-wing exiles from Castro's Cuba. In New Orleans, Oswald remained true to his image as an amateur Marxist, and this time the cause was Cuba. Soon after arriving, he was out on the streets distributing pro-Castro leaflets for the Fair Play for Cuba committee. Oswald was the committee's local spokesman and only member, a futile gesture in the New Orleans of 1963. Oswald had picked the very issue which had bedeviled the presidency of John F. Kennedy from the beginning. Fidel Castro's takeover was already a most urgent problem when Kennedy reached the White House. Dr. Carlos Bringuier, a rabidly anti-communist Cuban exile, encountered Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. Today, as then, Bringuier has no doubt about Oswald or who was behind his actions.
Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald killed Officer Tippit. Lee Harvey Oswald was a Marxist. Lee Harvey Oswald was a Castro follower. It has been proved that the Kennedy government was trying to get rid of Castro. I am sure that Castro get rid of Kennedy.
In the months before the assassination, billboards in the streets of Havana blatantly identified Cuban public enemy number one, President John F. Kennedy. And 3 months before the assassination, Fidel Castro publicly warned, United States leaders should realize that if they are aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, they themselves will not be safe. Today, Castro denies that he had anything to do with the assassination.
Why? Because we do not believe that the system is abolished by liquidating the leaders. It is the system that we opposed, the reactionary ideas, not the men. Our reaction to the assassination was one of grief, because it seemed to us a painful, tragic way for Kennedy's life to end.
Unknown to President Kennedy throughout his time at the White House, the CIA was hatching an extraordinary series of assassination plots against the life of Fidel Castro. These plots were never revealed to the Warren Commission, even though one of its members, Allen Dulles, had himself been director of the CIA when the plans were conceived. In 1976, one of the plot's coordinators secretly informed the government he believed some of his associates had gone on to murder the president. The sensational revelation, detailed in the Senate Intelligence Committee report, was that the CIA had recruited hitmen for the anti-Castro plots by making a deal with the mafia. This is how it happened. The CIA, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee, commissioned one of its consultants, Robert Mayhew, the right-hand man of Howard Hughes, to set up the contract. Johnny Roselli, mob leader in Las Vegas, was the first contact. He recruited Sam Giancana, the Chicago mafia leader, who in turn brought in Santos Trafficante, the man who had been at the top of the Havana mafia before Castro took over. The fashionable Fontainebleau Hotel, Miami, was the setting for one of the first meetings between the CIA and the mafia. Among those present was a man who now calls himself Dr. Peters. He has now chosen to live in a remote mountain farmhouse thousands of miles away from Miami.
We arrived at the Fontainebleau Hotel. We checked into a private suite that was occupied by Mr. John Roselli of Los Angeles and Vegas, and Sam Giancana from Chicago. I recall we were all down in the boom boom room having food and drinks. Now, as this conversation developed, I learned that Mayhew, through the CIA, had a contract to have Castro killed. The method to be used was a liquid, a little bottle, that was to be administered in his food, and it wouldn't take effect for 2 or 3 days. If it would make the person ill, it would take 2 or 3 days to kill him, but then an autopsy would not show the poison.
So why did the CIA need to go to the mafia?
They had no other way of getting to people in Cuba. You had to have some individual or somebody that knew a lot of Cubans and knew the type of Cubans that could be prevailed upon to get into such a plot.
Who would those contacts in Havana
Well,
be?
The main contact would have been Santos Trafficante.
Santos Trafficante was a man with good reason to join murder plots against Fidel Castro. In pre-revolutionary days, Havana had been the world capital of organized crime. Trafficante was one of its bosses. There was a profit of $100 million a year from gambling, prostitution, drugs, and luxury hotels. But under Castro, everything changed. Within 18 months, the hotels were deserted, the casinos nationalized, and Santos Trafficante was in jail. The humiliated mafiosi now had a common cause with America's invisible government.
Things did go on at the CIA that the president did not totally know about. That's become clear in the investigations of subsequent CIA activities in Cuba, most particularly the attempts to assassinate Castro. President Kennedy certainly knew nothing about that.
Are you saying that President Kennedy didn't know of the attempts by the CIA, the plots by the CIA to assassinate Castro?
Correct.
Did the president know about the liaison there was, clearly, between the CIA and the mafia?
No.
Although this had come to the notice of Robert Kennedy?
Yes, and I shouldn't say no so categorically, because I wasn't privy to all private conversations between the two of them. But again, bear in mind that that was a liaison established before the Kennedy administration took office. It was brought to the attention of Robert Kennedy in a context which indicated that that liaison had ended. So Robert Kennedy merely dismissed it, saying, anything like this again, make sure I know about it. So I doubt that it having ended, he would have brought it to the attention of the president.
In the years after the assassination of the president, Robert Kennedy was reportedly tormented by the notion that the CIA mafia plots had backfired against his brother. Judge Burt Griffin was one of the legal counsel for the Warren Commission. He now feels that the commission was duped by the CIA, which concealed its assassination plots against Castro.
I feel betrayed. I feel that the CIA lied to us, that we had an agency of government here which we were depending upon, that we expected to be truthful with us and to cooperate with us, and they didn't do it. CIA concealed from us the fact that they knew that they were involved in efforts to assassinate Fidel Castro, which could have been of extreme importance to us.
Especially as the CIA were involved in working with the mafia at that time.
Of course. If that had been told us, why it would have completed a set of links to a whole range of investigations that, based on the evidence that we did have, seemed to be speculative and unlikely to be productive.
One such area of evidence was a further episode in the strange travels of Lee Harvey Oswald, and it involved Cuba. Allegedly, he traveled to Mexico City, and according to the Warren Commission, made a visit to the Soviet embassy, and twice, with an urgent request for permission to visit Havana, to the Cuban embassy. The commission examined Oswald's visa for Mexico, number 24085. But in the list of other visa applicants made in New Orleans the same day, the FBI said it could not identify the person next to Oswald, 24084. It was not true. We now know the second traveler's identity. The missing name was William George Godet. His identity has been revealed only because of a bureaucratic blunder when another FBI document was declassified. At the time he received his visa from Mexico immediately before Oswald, Godet was and had been for years an operative for the CIA.
I cannot account for why my name was not on that list, and it actually should have been on it. Now, again, who was responsible, I don't know. People have inferred that maybe they found out because of my CIA connections, it'd be better my name was deleted from that list. I have no control over what the CIA did or didn't do down in Mexico.
Are you saying it was a pure coincidence that your name was on the list next to his?
I would say so, yes. I know it's hard to believe because this word coincidence keeps cropping up in everything that I seem to do, that I'm just loaded down with coincidences, and but I'll have to let it go at that.
The new Assassinations Committee has reopened the investigation into Oswald's alleged visit to Mexico City, and the story has grown stranger and stranger. The Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City were under 24-hour-a-day surveillance by the CIA. phone calls supposedly, and every person who entered the embassies was photographed by hidden cameras. But as the record now reveals, these were the photographs which the CIA produced. And according to the CIA, they purport to show a man who identified himself as Lee Harvey Oswald entering the Cuban embassy.
The photographs, allegedly, of Oswald going into the Cuban embassy, as we all know, in fact, were not photographs of Oswald. Secondly, it turns out that those photographs, even if they were of the wrong person, you would expect they would be of a person entering the Cuban embassy, but it turns out they are photographs of someone entering the Russian embassy, and there's a question raised, how could they so mix up even what building they're talking about? In addition, when we inquire, well, where were the photographs you took of people who entered the Cuban embassy on the day in question, we are told that the cameras did not work that day, and we then want to start talking. I want to talk to the camera people, and I want to find out, is that true? And that's where we get stopped.
Unbeknownst to me and deliberately denied to me during the hearings of my subcommittee was another set of photographs of this same man. We put Lee Harvey Oswald's name on them. We say we now don't know who he is, and we deliberately withheld from the Warren Commission and my committee 2 other photographs of this man in 2 separate changes of clothing. The cover-up is going on.
On whose instructions do you think those photographs could have been withheld now from your committee?
Well, it has to be somebody very high up in government who doesn't want it to come out. I don't know who held it up, but all I can say is I'm sure it was at the highest level, because I think this whole thing points to being at the highest level.
Because Oswald's alleged phone calls to the Russian and Cuban embassies in Mexico City were allegedly tape-recorded, the CIA presented the Warren Commission with a transcript of what he supposedly said, but it claimed the actual tapes were destroyed before President Kennedy's murder. The House Assassinations Committee learned differently.
The CIA said that they had reused that tape prior to the assassination of President Kennedy, yet the FBI has a document stating that some of their agents listened to the tape after the assassination of President Kennedy, and the voice on there was not Oswald's. In addition, the CIA presented a transcript of that conversation. We had interviewed the typist who typed it up, who said that the transcript presented was not, in fact, what was typed up by whoever it was who spoke on that conversation. These are areas that I wanted to get into.
There is now new evidence that someone in the CIA did try to implicate Cuba in the assassination, and on top of that, confuse the investigation into the activities of the real Lee Harvey Oswald. Antonio Veciana was once a CIA operative. He says that within days of the assassination, his CIA case officer asked him to persuade his cousin Reese in Cuba's embassy in Mexico to say Oswald had been there.
He questioned me, do you think if we can offer good money, a great deal of money to Reese Harvey Oswald in Mexico?
So you think that the American case officer, the American intelligence officer, was trying to make up a story?
Yes.
Why did you never give this information to the Warren Commission?
I never received a subpoena, or I never received a call. And in my profession, you know, this is a risk to talk. And now it's 15 years. But in that time, it's better to be quiet and to be silent.
Sometimes we ask ourselves if someone did not wish to involve Cuba in this, because I'm under the impression that Kennedy's assassination was organized by reactionaries in the United States, and that it was all the result of a conspiracy. This is my opinion, and my impression is that the man who carried it out was a provocateur.
The great hope of the Cuban exiles during Kennedy's presidency was the amphibious landing at the Bay of Pigs. Instead, it was a victory for Castro. In the wake of the exiles' defeat, President Kennedy seemed to provide the boost of morale the exiles needed.
Castro and his fellow dictators may rule nations, they do not rule people.
They may imprison bodies, but they do not imprison spirit. They may destroy the exercise of liberty, but they cannot eliminate the determination to be free.
Thousands of dispossessed Cubans gathered to hear the president in Miami, and the promise in his words was just what they wanted to hear.
I can assure you that this flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana.
The speech was rapturously received, but in the crowd were many who blamed Kennedy for not intervening at the Bay of Pigs. U.S. authorities were now actually preventing many guerrilla raids against Castro, and some suspected Kennedy was going soft on communism. In the eyes of some CIA-trained militants, Kennedy had become a traitor to the cause. At that time, in late 1962, Jerry Hemming, ex-Marine and intelligence operative, was training anti-Castro guerrillas. He worked with some of the most violent Cuban militants, with the most passionate feelings about the exile cause.
Were you ever offered money to assassinate President Kennedy?
Directly, on numerous occasions. In our activities seeking support for the Cuban exiles, we encountered people from most of the what we'd call a varied political spectrum. The majority of them right-wingers, conservatives, anti-communists. Within these elements, groups of people, there were quite a few very outspoken. As relationships developed and as time went on, some of them very pointedly made statements as to how to resolve the communist menace, how to resolve Castro. Quite often it would boil down to, why are we wasting our time trying to get Castro? Why don't we go to the root of the problem and eliminate the communists in Washington, the #1 man, JFK?
In the 6 months before the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald stepped into yet another role and created new mysteries. This was to be perhaps the most contradictory episode of all. For during his time in New Orleans, Oswald, on the street, the pro-Castro agitator, cultivated opposite causes and unlikely friends. Oswald went privately to offer his services and military experience to Carlos Bringuier, who was a leading member of an exile organization set up by the CIA.
He was claiming that he was anti-Castro, that he had experience in guerrilla warfare and training in the Marines, and that he was willing to train Cubans to fight against Castro.
2 days later, Bringuier was outraged to see Oswald handing out pro-Castro leaflets.
I encountered him with the sign, Viva Castro and Hands Off Cuba. Viva Fidel was this reading of the sign.
Viva Fidel.
Viva Fidel. And I was surprised when it was the same man that has been in my store offering his service to train Cubans.
One of the most important Warren Commission witnesses about the double life of Lee Harvey Oswald has never before agreed to speak publicly. Sylvia Odillo, who has now changed her name and residence. She lived here in Dallas in September 1963. She was a wealthy Cuban exile activist. 2 months before the assassination, she received a visit from 2 Latins and 1 American, at the time when Lee Harvey Oswald was supposedly visiting the Cuban embassy in Mexico.
I was visited by a man and 2 other men, but specifically Lee Harvey Oswald, even though he introduced himself as Leon Harvey Oswald at the time.
You have no doubt at all in your mind, now or then, that this was Lee Harvey Oswald?
Oh, no, not at all. He was Lee Harvey Oswald.
At the meeting, Oswald and the 2 men told Mrs. Odillo they had just come from New Orleans and wanted to know if she would finance some anti-Castro operations they were planning. She refused, but the next morning she received a telephone call from one of the 2 Latins.
It was from Leopoldo, which was the tall guy. And he told me the first thing he said was, "What do you think of the American?" And I said, well, I didn't think very much. I didn't make an opinion. He says, well, you know, he's kind of loco. Loco means crazy in Spanish, and kind of nuts. And he's a Marine, an ex-Marine. He's an expert marksman, and he would be a tremendous asset to anyone, except that he said, you never know how to take him. You know, he can go either way. So I didn't know if he was trying to sell him to me or he was trying to get an opinion from me. See what I mean? So this guy, Leopoldo, insisted that the American had said that we Cubans should have shot President Kennedy after Bay of Pigs, that we didn't have any guts, and that we should do something like that. So immediately I realized that there was an assassination idea or plot.
The Warren Commission was disturbed by Mrs. Odio's testimony. Papers now declassified show that Commission staffers found Mrs. Odio extremely credible, but members of the Commission decided to ignore her story. The Chief Counsel, J. Lee Rankin, said testily, "At this stage, we are supposed to be closing doors, not opening them." That may have been a bad misjudgment.
I still believe that he had nothing to do with Cuba, with Fidel Castro. I still believe that he had something to do with sources within the United States, using perhaps Cubans in this conspiracy. And I still believe that it is a conspiracy.
And the interesting thing is that here was Oswald, who had two associations. One is with Sylvia Odio, with a group of anti-Castro Cubans, so he was clearly with them and associating with them, who had some motivation. Same time, he was handing out leaflets for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee with the other side of the fence. So the two groups that had the most motivation to assassinate the president, he was dealing with, and we decided not to investigate either avenue. We didn't want to be embarrassed by the Cuban connection.
Was there no investigation at all of Oswald's connections with the pro and anti-Castro factions?
Very little. In fact, this gets back to being an agent or double agent, because he played both roles. Many people said he was a forthright, upstanding American as a young person, and yet later depicted him as a Castro-loving, Cuban-loving, Russian-loving person. That smacks of an intelligence relationship of someone who's assuming a false identity.
There is now considerable evidence of Oswald's links with agents from the CIA and the FBI in the months before the assassination. In August 1963 in Dallas, the CIA operative Antonio Veciana met with his case officer Maurice Bishop. Bishop was the CIA coordinator of the most violent anti-Castro exile group. And in Dallas, he also met with Lee Harvey Oswald.
I saw Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas in a meeting of 10 or 15 minutes with Mr. Maurice Bishop in Dallas in that time.
And you feel certain that Oswald was working with or associated with American intelligence?
Well, at least he was associated with Maurice Bishop. And if Maurice Bishop was intelligence, he was working for the intelligence service in the United States, I don't doubt that he was working with him.
Before the Dallas meeting, Oswald had lived for 5 months in New Orleans. There he had stamped on the bottom of some of his pro-Castro leaflets the address 544 Camp Street. But this was the center for anti-Castro activities. It was occupied by a former top FBI agent, Guy Bannister, now heavily involved with right-wing Cuban exiles. Bannister met with Lee Harvey Oswald.
I do know that I saw him one time with a former, I think he was an FBI agent, a man by the name of Guy Bannister. And Guy, of course, is now dead. What Guy's role was in all of this, I really don't know. But I did see him discussing various things with Bannister at the time, and I think Bannister knew a whole lot of what was going on.
In Magazine Street, New Orleans, Oswald worked for the William Riley Coffee Company and would often make visits next door to the Crescent City garage. It was the garage that the FBI used to park its unmarked cars. Its owner, Adrian Alba, says that on at least 2 occasions he personally witnessed Lee Harvey Oswald receiving white envelopes delivered in cars that were part of the FBI pool. Alba had no idea what the envelopes contained. He is now afraid to talk publicly, like another witness who privately confirms that he saw Oswald in the company of an FBI special agent in New Orleans. It has now become clear that the FBI did have something to hide in its relationship with Oswald. 2 years ago, the House committee charged with oversight of the FBI called the Bureau's special agent in Dallas at the time of the assassination to testify. He is James Hosty. His name and address were eventually found in Oswald's notebook, though they had originally been removed by the FBI. Now Hoffa was to reveal a more startling cover-up. He had received a note from Oswald just before the president was killed. Hoffa sent the note and a memo to his superior, Gordon Shanklin.
The memorandum and the note in question, and he handed it to me, and he said, in effect, Oswald's dead now, there can be no trial. Here, get rid of this. I then proceeded to tear it up. His presence, he said, no, get it out of here. I don't even want it in this office. Get rid of it. I then took it out and destroyed it.
And how did you destroy it?
I took it into the washroom and flushed it down the drain.
Agents filled out it.
I understand about 30.
About 30. How many in the Washington field office and headquarters?
To my knowledge, none.
Well, wasn't Mr. Shanklin on the telephone a lot with J. Edgar Hoover?
He was on the telephone to FBI headquarters. I don't know specifically who he was talking to.
Were he and Mr. Hoover rather close?
Well, he worked for Mr. Hoover and he reported to him.
The feisty J. Edgar Hoover was determined that the FBI should emerge with its reputation enhanced from the assassination inquiry. But it's now clear from the Senate Intelligence Committee report that Hoover and his top aides deliberately withheld many vital areas of information from the Warren Commission. The commission had no independent investigators and relied totally on the FBI.
Did you trust J. Edgar Hoover?
I don't think any of us trusted J. Edgar Hoover when it came to the question of the image of the FBI.
But do you think that for one reason or another, the FBI deliberately misled the Warren Commission?
Well, I think in any area where Oswald's relationship to the FBI, even as a suspect from the FBI, could have supplied a motive for Oswald, in those areas we could not trust Hoover.
I'm just a patsy.
I'm a patsy, said Oswald. But whatever he might eventually have revealed about his links with intelligence agents was lost to history when he was silenced forever in Dallas Police Headquarters.
You have anything to say in your defense? Oswald has been shot.
The suspect's name is Jack Rubenstein, I believe. He goes by the name of Jack Ruby.
Jack Ruby, the Dallas strip club owner, claimed his sensational debut on national television was purely spontaneous. He told the Warren Commission he shot Oswald in a moment of frenzy to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the grief of returning to Dallas for Oswald's trial. His lawyer, Tom Howard, confirmed this moving tale.
He told me that really the first thing that he remembered of the shooting itself was when he was in the homicide office after the shooting, and he says they were shouting, and someone was shouting at him, "You shot Oswald. Why did you shoot Oswald?" And that's really the first recollection he has of it. I would think that we would at least plead temporary insanity.
Years later, it became clear that Ruby's reason for shooting Oswald was just a clever lawyer's invention. In a note to a different lawyer at his trial, 7 months after the assassination, Ruby wrote, "You should know this. Tom Howard told me to say that I shot Oswald so that Caroline and Mrs. Kennedy wouldn't have to come to Dallas to testify. Okay?" This note was unknown to the Warren Commission or to the jury in Ruby's trial, as was much else about the life of Jack Ruby. The commission found no substantiation for rumors linking Ruby with pro- or anti-Castro activities, and no significant link between Ruby and organized crime. Jack Ruby died of cancer in 1967. He's buried in Chicago, where his career began. In the 30s, under his original name, Jack Rubenstein, he was a runner for Al Capone. In 1939, he made the news. He was involved in police inquiries following the murder of a Chicago union boss. Jack Rubenstein was then the local union secretary. 20 years later, Robert Kennedy, in his book on the underworld, The Enemy Within, called this murder a key step towards mafia domination of the Teamsters Union. From Chicago, Ruby moved to Dallas, where he was to run the Vegas and Carousel strip clubs. But in report after report from the FBI and Dallas police, Ruby is identified as a key figure in narcotics, gambling, and prostitution. Jack Ruby was the man to see in Dallas. His best friend, who represented Ruby's direct link to the top mafia bosses, was Louis J. McWillie. "I idolized that boy," Ruby told the Warren Commission. In 1958, McWillie left for Cuba. And Ruby became involved in running guns to Castro. The guns came from the mafia, who wanted Castro to be in its debt. At the time, the boss of the Havana underworld was Santos Traficante, and he employed Louis J. McWillie. A recently declassified FBI document that intrigued the Senate Intelligence Committee indicates that McWillie became a close associate of some of the most prominent mafia leaders. The report indicates McWillie solidified his syndicate connections through his association with Santos Traficante. Traficante was jailed when Castro took over. Then Ruby contacted an intimate of Castro, the gun runner, Robert McKeon.
He wanted to know if he could come down to talk to me about a few things that he wanted to talk about. Getting somebody out of Cuba, if I could help him get him out. I said, well, that's all right, come on down. So I think the next day he came out to the bar where I owned it. And he walked up, and he was well dressed. He was dressed real nice, you know, and he introduced himself to me, and I said, well, you're the one that called last night. He said, yeah, my name is Ruby, Jack Ruby. I'd like to go over to Cuba, but he said, what if you'd give me a letter of introduction to Castro? I said, no, I wouldn't want to do anything like that. He said, well, I certainly would make it worth your while to do it. I said, what do you mean worth my while? And he said, well, it'd be worth a lot of money to me. And I said, well, I don't know how much money it'd be worth. I said, but... And so he mentioned $25,000, but to my opinion, that was quite a bit of money. Well, I found out later through friends of mine that he did go to Cuba and he did use my name.
There is documentary evidence that when Ruby reached Havana, he paid several visits to the jailed mafia leader, Santos Traficante. It comes in a declassified CIA cable quoting a British journalist who was in the same jail as Traficante. The memo says, Traficante was visited frequently by an American gangster type named Ruby. Traficante was released after 6 months in jail. He left Havana to run the organized crime empire in Florida.
Nothing in relation to this, okay? So, no comment.
It was in Miami that Traficante became the top coordinator of the secret CIA mafia plots against Castro, working with Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana. But while the invisible arm of the American government was embracing the mob, all unknown to President Kennedy, his administration had launched an unprecedented war on organized crime, led by Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time. I think a lot of steps can be taken in order to deal with the problem. I think it's gotten much more serious over the period of the last 10 years.
During the Kennedy administration, organized crime convictions increased from 35 in 1960 to 160 3 years later. And in the same period, the number of mafia leaders targeted for prosecution rose from 40 to 2,300. Robert Kennedy's first major target was Carlos Marcello, still one of the 3 most powerful mafia leaders in the country. His personal empire extends through Texas and most southern and border states. His base is in New Orleans, in a state where crime income is put at over $1 billion a year. Marcello had long been an adversary of the Kennedys, since he had appeared before their senatorial committee on organized crime and exercised his constitutional rights.
Of government to keep unionization out of Jefferson Parish. I decline to answer on the ground of mere intent incrimination. Now, according to the information that we have, you are an associate of Mr. Frank Costello, is that right? I decline to answer on the same ground.
In 1961, Marcello was picked up on the street and deported to Guatemala. The Attorney General had struck. It was a public humiliation that Marcello did not forget. After legal finagling, he returned to America, and in September 1962, he called a meeting at a hunting lodge outside New Orleans. One of those present told Pulitzer Prize-winning crime journalist Ed Reed how Marcello sought revenge on Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby, to him, represented what the citizens like to think of as a stone in his shoe, a place where it hurts the most
tarpa, which means take the stone out of my shoe. And of course, this is a reflection of the bitterness that was within Carlos Marcello, and my informant heard him say very distinctly that in order to do away with Bobby, you had to get rid of the President of the United States, and that you had to find a nut who would be capable of assassinating the President. Well, Carlos said, if you cut the head off a rooster, the tail falls off. And this was the reason he gave for going for the President, Jack Kennedy, instead of Bobby Kennedy.
Marcello's reported threat was no isolated event. Mob minds think alike. At exactly the same time in Miami Beach, two men met in the Scott Bryant Hotel. One was Jose Alaman, a wealthy Cuban exile. The other was Santos Traficante. Traficante had promised to loan Alaman $1.5 million. It was to come from the mafia-dominated Teamsters Union led by Jimmy Hoffa. Traficante told Alaman, Jimmy Hoffa has personally okayed it.
Pot-bellied, slick individuals who represent the employers in Congress.
But to Traficante's fury, Hoffa and the Teamsters were now the major targets of the Kennedys' personal war on organized crime. Traficante told Alaman, have you seen how the president's brother is hitting Hoffa? He doesn't know that this kind of encounter is very delicate. Mark my words, this man Kennedy is in trouble, and he will get what is coming to him. When Alaman countered that he thought Kennedy would be reelected, Traficante retorted, no, Jose, he is going to be hit. Before the assassination, Alaman, who was regarded as highly reliable by the FBI, reported Traficante's threat to the Bureau. Alaman was never asked to testify to the Warren Commission, nor was Traficante. The new House Assassinations Committee sees things differently.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth, as you shall answer unto God. Thank you. You may be seated.
Last year, it subpoenaed Santos Traficante and asked him, did you ever discuss plans to assassinate President Kennedy? Prior to November 22nd, 1963, did you know Jack Ruby? While you were in prison in Cuba, were you visited by Jack Ruby? Traficante's lawyer, who also has Carlos Marcello as a client, asked for the television cameras to be excluded. Traficante then replied to all three questions. I respectfully refuse to answer, pursuant to my constitutional rights under the 1st, 4th, 5th, and 14th Amendments. Two of Traficante's associates in the CIA mafia plots against Castro were not so fortunate. In 1963, Sam Giancana was obsessed about the Kennedys' assault on organized crime, with good reason. Robert Kennedy had placed him top of the hit list for special attention. In 1975, Giancana was shot dead after he had been slated to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee. A year after Giancana's death, Johnny Roselli did testify in secret. Roselli, it emerges, had met Jack Ruby in Miami 2 months before the Kennedy assassination. He apparently told the committee his co-conspirators in the CIA mafia plots had gone on to murder Kennedy. And Jack Ruby was ordered to eliminate Oswald, said Roselli. 2 months after giving new secret information to Intelligence Committee investigators, Roselli's mutilated body was found floating in Miami's Dumbfoundling Bay, stuffed in an oil drum.
He was killed to shut him up once and for all. You see, originally, now this is personal opinion, originally this was to be a great secret. This was never to leak. Now, this is a terrible thing to have one country plotting to kill the leader of another country. Mayhew blew it first. He became the squealer, so he was out. The rest of us all kept quiet, forgot about it. I never heard of it.
Who wanted to stop Johnny Roselli talking?
Well, it'd be my opinion that there's only one man that had most to lose. I don't want to name him because I have no proof. One man who's very big and has a big business. It's an unlawful business, illegal business. He was involved. he did not want, and he was given a guarantee, I understand, when they talked to him, that he would never surface, his name would never be used. This was to be a great secret. When the Senate committee was formed, the headlines in Chicago said Giancano is, hired to kill Castro. So a few days later, before Sam can come here to testify, he's dead. There's a gun found a few days later. The gun originally was purchased in Miami. Now, when do you get a hitman in Chicago going all the way to Miami to buy a gun? Then in Chicago, you get a gun on every corner. Somebody didn't want Sam to testify, and all Sam was going to say, I gave a contact to Santos. Period. I don't know anything more about it.
Santos Trafficante.
That would have been the headline.
Was there anything about the way they were killed that indicated?
Well, in Sam's case, the shooting, placing the bullets around the mouth, which is a mob's way of saying, keep your mouth shut, seal his lips. It's an old mob method to warn others not to talk.
The Kennedy War on Organized Crime had begun in the late 50s when they probed union corruption and Jimmy Hoffa's role in the Teamster Mafia alliance.
The fact that this is a strike-breaking, union-busting bill, in my opinion. Mr. Hoffa, this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that numerous people who hold responsible positions in your union come before this committee and take the Fifth Amendment because an honest answer might tend to incriminate them.
Leaving one committee session, Hoffa was heard to mutter, "That SOB, I'll break his back, the little son of a bitch." The next morning, Bobby Kennedy picked up the remark.
While leaving the hearings, after these people had testified regarding this matter, did you say, "That SOB, I'll break his back"?
Who?
You.
Say to who?
To anyone. Did you make that statement after these people testified before the committee?
I never talked to either one of them after testifying.
No, I'm not talking about to them. Did you make that statement here in the hearing room after the testimony was finished?
Not concerning them, far as I know of.
Well, who did you make it about?
I don't know. I may have been discussing somebody in a figure of speech.
Well, who did you make the statement? Whose back were you going to break?
I don't even remember it.
Well, whose back were you going to break, Mr. Hoffa?
Figure of speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
When Jack Kennedy became president and his brother attorney general, the war with Hoffa intensified. Robert Kennedy set up a special task force. It was known as the Get Hoffa Squad. Over 190 Teamster officials and associates, many of them underworld figures, were indicted while John Kennedy was president.
I had no respect for him on the committee as a senator, and I had nothing to do with him as president because I did not believe that he viewed the Teamsters other than a stepping stone for his advancement, and that he would have done anything, in my personal opinion, to destroy the Teamsters Union because he could not have his way with the Teamsters Union, particularly myself. An absolute spoiled brat, a man who never had to work, a man who had no principle. I had no respect for him then, I have no respect for his memory now.
The tough man Hoffa did not take threats from anyone.
It will not happen to him if he does, he's going to get hurt.
Hoffa himself is now presumed slain. He disappeared while attempting to regain control of the Teamsters. But in 1962, as his problems with the Justice Department grew, Hoffa seemed prepared to take his violent hatred of the Kennedy brothers to the ultimate extreme. At that time, Edward Parton was one of Hoffa's top lieutenants. Parton says that while at Teamsters headquarters in Washington, Hoffa said of Robert Kennedy, "Someone needs to bump that son of a bitch off. His house isn't guarded. You know somewhere where you can get a hold of a plastic bomb? Somebody must be got to throw one in his house, and the place will burn after it blows up."
I learned in 1962 that Mr. Parton had been entrusted with the mission of securing plastic explosives to be used in either blowing up Mr. Bobby Kennedy, then the U.S. Attorney General, in his automobile or in his home.
Did you learn anything that backed that up from your own personal experience?
Yes, there were 2 telephone calls that were monitored by me. The calls originated with Mr. Parton and terminated with Mr. Hoffa on the other end of the line. Mr. Parton discussed as briefly as possible, being cut off by Mr. Hoffa, that he had obtained the plastic explosive that Mr. Hoffa was seeking.
Do you consider that Mr. Hoffa's hatred or motive for murder was directed against the Kennedys in general?
Yes, I do.
And could also have been directed against the president?
Yes, I believe that.
Were there close links between Hoffa and the leaders of organized crime?
Those who are purportedly members of organized crime, such as Mr. Carlos Marcella of New Orleans, was closely linked to Mr. Hoffa, according to what Mr. Hoffa told me in 1964.
Was he capable of carrying out his threats?
I think that he fully intended to carry the threats out. I really think that he had the capability. It was a question of how and when, not a question of whether he had doubts as to the necessity of eliminating at least Mr. Bobby Kennedy.
And possibly his brother also.
And possibly his brother also.
We contacted Edward Parton, who lives in Louisiana and was a key prosecution witness against Hoffa in 1964. Hoffa was sentenced to 8 years in prison for a jury tampering offense. Parton agreed to meet us for an interview in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at the Holiday Inn. Mr. Parton never turned up for the interview, although we waited many hours. He made himself impossible to contact, either at his home or his office. But eventually, this letter from Parton reached us. He said, "I'm sorry. I can't keep the appointment with you for the safety of my family and myself, especially my family, whom I have had to move out of the state and hide. I just don't think it would be fair to them. All I can say is that if you live in Louisiana, there are a couple of high-up officials who have links with certain people that a person would have to be a fool not to know the games they play. I pray that someday high officials of the country or the news media can see under their cloak of respectability and expose them for what they are. I have seen some of the injustices handed down since Hoffa's existence, and I want my children to not have to live in it, because until now they have only known fear, death, and the threat of death. Sincerely, E.G. Parton." It is now known that in the month before the assassination, Jack Ruby was in contact with some of the most powerful Teamster officials in the country, including Barney Baker, described by Robert Kennedy as Hoffa's roving organizer and ambassador of violence. Before he died, Jack Ruby gave one interview not seen till now on national television.
The only thing I can say, what is your name, and I'll know how to go.
Harry Kendall.
Harry Kendall. Everything pertaining to what's on the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. In other words, I'm the only person in the background that knows the truth pertaining to everything relating to my circumstances.
Do you think it'll ever come out?
No, because unfortunately, the people that had so much to gain and have such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come of their boards to the world.
Now, these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
Arlington Cemetery, winter, 1978. Every season that passes renders the truth about President Kennedy's death at once more remote and more urgent to discover. What we know now, but didn't know then, made the reopening of the investigation imperative. The Warren Commission acted to squelch what it called dirty rumors, but many of them have turned out to be true. It no longer seems paranoid to brood about the suggestive and possibly monstrous interconnections between all the evidence that has emerged. President Kennedy is dead, and nothing will bring him back. But as with Watergate, the unraveling of the cover-up may tell the American people more than the crime itself.
What is most disturbing to me is that two agencies of our government that were supposed to be loyal and faithful to us deliberately lied to us.
I feel outraged that we have not discovered the truth when I think the American public needs to know the truth for history's sake, for all of us. I'm very angry at all the forces that I cannot understand.
So much has happened, not only with respect to the CIA, but with respect to Watergate and so on, that I obviously cannot exclude anything as being beyond the realm of possibility. The impossible has happened many, many times.
One of the biggest cover-ups in the history of our country occurred at that time.